How I teach the hinge. I start with Dan John's exercise, Bulgarian Goat Bellies. From there, we include glute bridges because they help teach you how to actually finish extending your hips, which is something a lot of people struggle to do, spending a lot of time not quite standing up all the way, never really extending their hips vigorously. It's a sad life for those people. We'll also play around with shoulder extension. This isn't strictly part of the hip hinge, but it does help teach a necessary movement for the deadlift. I'll then introduce the Sumo Deadlift, followed by the barbell Sumo Deadlift, followed by the regular conventional deadlift, and then finally we'll play around with a Snatch Grip Deadlift. A lot of my pulls, a little bit more advanced, we'll play with the Olympic lifting variations. I'm not super comfortable teaching those online. I'm not super comfortable teaching any of this online. Please don't kill yourself. But I think that they'll require a bit more hands-on face-to-face coaching. I might do a video on the Olympic lifts later on, but we're going to focus more on the deadlifting variations in this hinge video. Hinge. Keeping my belly tight, push my hips back, and with my nice flat back, not a round back. I'm not allowing my weight to tip forward. With a nice flat back, I'm pushing my hips back, loading my posterior chain, so my hamstrings and my glutes. I'll allow a slight bend in the knees just to take a tiny bit of the pressure off the hamstrings, but I'm not tipping forward and I'm not turning it into a squat by bending my knees a whole bunch. Control down, up, and straighten the hips and knees. We can do a loaded hinge. Dan John calls these goat belly swings, where you hug the bell, kettlebell or dumbbell, into your belly. That helps remind you to brace your abs and keep your back straight as you push your hips back and then extend them forward. We can do the same thing with a kettlebell. Hug it into your belly and push the hips back and then extend them forward. Boom. Push them back and extend them forward. Boom. Good. I make sure everyone can do this competently before I move them on to the deadlift. It just helps to break it down into smaller chunks. Make sure you've wrapped your head around those little pieces before we put it all together in a big complicated movement. One of those pieces is the hip thrust here, getting the glutes on. I'm not a huge fan of loaded hip thrusts, but just to teach you how to get that glute activation and to get that hip extension, I'm a fan of just the regular glute bridge, maybe going a quarter of the way down here and squeezing at the top. I'm making sure that I don't overarch my back. I keep my tail tucked under and I extend my hips all the way at the top every time, squeezing my bum. That's a helpful teaching tool for our deadlift. Here we have some handy help from Andrew. And I'm going to teach him how to shift his weight back and also to apply a little bit of extension through the shoulders. This is a really important aspect of deadlifting. You need to keep the bar close and you need to lever your own weight back a little bit to stop you tipping over. He did a good job there. So as an introduction, before we start deadlifting with a barbell, I'll begin with a kettlebell deadlift. Lift up through the chest, tight belly, hips go back, and we stand up and squeeze the glutes. Simple as that. Think about lifting up through the arches of the feet, spreading out through the toes and gripping the ground. It's handy if you can have fairly minimalist footwear. For deadlifts, some guys will deadlift in deadlift slippers or specific shoes. Here I'm demonstrating barefoot. You can see how I'm connecting with the ground. I can actually pull the bell back between my legs. That's one of the advantages of a kettlebell. Not going to hit my shins. I can really get that weight back. Get the idea for that. There's a double kettlebell deadlift. Again, keeping organized through the spine. I'm not going to let my back round or arch more than it needs to. It's basically neutral. I'm not a crazy advocate of neutral spine, but we do want to have a neutral spine when we're loading it heavily like this. All right, so now I'm introducing the bar. Just deadlifting with the bar. We're adding those different pieces together. We've got the hinge to come down. At the top, we have the hip extension. Notice that I'm not doing any of those horrible things, allowing my shoulders to collapse forward, allowing my back to overarch or round, allowing my knees to travel forward. These are all common faults. Allowing your knees to collapse in, that's another common fault. So we're putting together that hinge. There's a little bit of knee bend off the ground. It's a little bit like a leg press at the bottom. And then at the top, squeezing the glutes like in our hip thrusts, keeping the shoulders back, Notice again, knees don't collapse, we're not twisting over to one side. Keep the hips nice and open. My stance might be a bit wide in that one. Not rounding, not traveling forward, not hitching. Often when people's grip is tired, you find these things going wrong. Keep it nice and close. Don't let the bar drift away from your shins. Keep it back. Keep your weight back. And all the way up. Nice and strong. Squeezing at the top. Squeezing at the top. Our Sumo Deadlift, where you take a wide stance, you open up through the hips, push the bum back, and stand all the way up. I'll usually teach this one before the conventional deadlift, after the kettlebell sumo deadlift. It's essentially the same as with our regular deadlift. It's a bit hard without any weight on it there to demonstrate, but you actually will wind into position at the bottom, not letting the knees collapse in from the sides. Okay, I was a little tight while demonstrating the sumo deadlift, and there's a point I'd like to emphasize. So we're going to look at it here with the broom. Note that my knees are out, so that over my ankles I am abducting. That means I'm spreading from my hips like I'm doing the side splits, and I'm really getting my knees out and back during a sumo deadlift. You'll be a bit more upright, use your glutes and your abs in a bit of a different way, a bit less quads. Avoid the knees collapsing in. Part of the problem with that can be grip. So same with the conventional, if my grip's too narrow, I don't have room for my knees to do the right thing. We want to avoid that. So everything's nice and open. I often do a fairly wide grip with the hands just to make sure people have room. Here's a very wide grip in the form of a Snatch Grip Deadlift, all the way up, squeezing the bum at the top. This can be a handy one. Look a little bit crooked at the bottom there. Same deal, but with the wider grip, it's just a bit of a longer range of motion, which makes the movement a little bit more challenging. I wouldn't teach this one until they're already competent at the other movements. We'll grab a little bit of weight so you can see what it's like with a little bit of load. So if I pull my back into position before I lift off, I'm making sure that it's set in advance of lifting off the ground. I'm not going to suddenly yank it off without setting my back. I'm going to pull the slack out of the system, set strongly, and then begin the lift. I also want to make sure I'm not on my toes off the ground. As I add the weight, it will tend to yank me forward. So it's important that I include that weight in my balance before I start to lift it off the ground, like this. The kettlebell swing has a flat back. I begin by hiking it back between my legs, and then my hips extend like they would for a deadlift. I push through my heels, and it's almost like I'm going to jump, except instead of me jumping, the kettlebell flies up. I'm not holding on very tightly at the top. I'm not lifting with just my shoulders. The momentum comes from my hips. And I'm not just letting it fly up and letting gravity take it back down. I'm actually going to actively pull it back down. As we'll see on this next rep, I stop it and I pull it back down using my abs after extending my hips at the top. This enables you to swing a bit faster as well, which is fun. Please don't throw your kettlebells.